Athletes calls for social justice, and here to help us out with that, we have culture commentator, also podcast host, Angela Rye. Angela, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you. So I want to get your thoughts on LeBron's statements that he made last night that Black Lives Matter isn't just a movement, but more a lifestyle.
I love that so much. I remember when Black Lives Matter was created. And again, I just want to thank the queens, Patrice, Opal, and Alicia, for having the foresight to know that it was an affirmation that the country would need to embrace. And when they started saying Black Lives Matter, of course, it initially started online. It was an argument, right? And so when LeBron talks about the fact that it's not about a moment, it's not about a movement, it's about a lifestyle, what he's talking about is the importance of us embracing ourselves, that Black lives do in fact matter, the importance of this country that started with the belief system that Black people who were here, brought here in chains, in shackles, were less than human, 3/5 human to be exact. It's time for us to be deemed fully human, 5/5, and that means that our lives have to matter as much as everyone else's. And so it isn't just about this particular moment. It isn't just about this particular paradigm shift. It is about a way of being that says we are exactly who we are, and we stand fully flat-footed on the foundation of this country that we helped to build, uncompensated, by the way. And we matter as much as you. And it's time for you to see our humanity in 2020, when your vision should be perfectly clear.
Love that.
So I was fortunate enough to moderate a podcast this week with NFL superstar Todd Gurley, Bun B, and Martin King III. And one of the things he talked about is how we can use our peaceful protest in multiple ways. And he acknowledged the fact that blacks have $1 trillion in spending equity. And as we talk so much about nonviolent protests, so many times we think and or see the imagery of black people getting squirted with fire hoses and bitten by dogs. But another way we can use that power is how we spend our money.
Good point.
That's also a way to exercise that power. And for those people who've seen this change recently happen in the country, Confederates being taken down, legislations in certain aspects being changed, Black Lives Matter being rolled on a basketball court as well as streets across the country, just know that came because of protest.
Yeah.
Had George Floyd not gotten murdered for almost 9 minutes and the world didn't get in an uproar, then those changes wouldn't have happened. So protest is a very effective method, and it's something that's been used in this country and will continue to be used as we shoot for the justice that we desire. So like LeBron said, we're graduating from movement, okay? This is a lifestyle because this is forever. That change is systemic, and in order for it to change, it's not going to take place overnight.
Jalen, I think the important distinction to make here is it wasn't just that George Floyd was murdered for 9 minutes. It was actually that someone filmed it, because you've seen time and time again that it's the imagery that sort of creates the uproar, not the incident. I think that's an important distinction to make. And in listening to LeBron speak, it made me think about something else that happened tragically in the past couple of weeks, and that's the passing of John Lewis. John Lewis was obviously famous for his work for civil rights early on in the civil rights movement, but he didn't stop. You know, it was a lifestyle for him. It was a lifelong commitment. And Angela, I know that you worked with him, so can you add to that?
Yeah, I love that. Both really good points, and I definitely want to talk about economic boycotts for a second too. But as it relates to Congressman Lewis, what a hero and a champion. We see superheroes in comic books at a young age. When John Lewis spoke at the March on Washington, he was in his 20s, his early 20s, right? And when he walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and got beat in the head just for simply requiring the right to vote, he did that as a sacrifice, not just for himself, but for all of us. You know, it was such a great thing to see last year when John Lewis was able to preside over the House floor, to watch the Voting Rights Advancement Act passage, H.R. 4, which was passed last year in the House. The Senate has yet to take up that bill. And so what I would be remiss in saying as a former executive director of the Congressional Black Caucus is to not acknowledge right, that he was not only a champion, Jacoby, to your point, he was an advocate, one that pushed to the very end to ensure voting rights parity in this country, even when the Supreme Court dialed back voting rights. Even as we see right now, voter suppression running rampant all throughout this country, John Lewis till the very end was fighting for that. And so we're requiring right now that the Senate be responsible, not just to his legacy, but to protect future generations and the present, and pass John Lewis's Voting Rights Advancement Act. That's what they need to do immediately.
Angela, I have a question.
Wait, I had a break. So that means I can hit the economic boycotts point really quick, Jalen. You raised a really good point around our spending power. So often, Black people are talked about as consumers, right? And very rarely talked about as owners, which I think perpetuates that narrative, right? Of, okay, well, let's talk about spending power. We can withhold our money, but we don't talk about what happens after we withhold our dollars. It is to empower Black businesses in our community. My dad, when I was young, had this, it was like our version of a Black Yellow Pages. Young people don't even know what Yellow Pages are. Look that up on the internet, y'all. But we had a Black version of that. And every time I asked my dad for anything, I'd be like, Dad, I didn't like my school pictures. Can I get a photographer and take new pictures? He would throw, not violently, but he would toss this book at me and say, find a Black photographer, find a Black bookstore, find a Black grocer, and he was serious about it. So I grew up with that paradigm. I recognize that too as a point of privilege, and knowing that everybody doesn't have that. What we're seeing is this shift to going back to that. That also is not new. In Dr. King's last speech in Memphis, talking to and protesting with the sanitation workers, he turns to Reverend Jackson in that speech and he says, Jesse, what are the names of the companies again? And Reverend Jackson lists the names of the companies that they're boycotting because they haven't respected their person, and therefore they don't have the opportunity to respect their power.
And also, sometimes we throw the term protest out there, but there's a disruptive way to do that and a passive way to do that. That's what Colin Kaepernick chose to do at his job. And so for those that question why colored people choose to use that as a method, and yes, when you have large gatherings of people that get angry, guess what? It's going to spill and be uncomfortable, and you're going to see some looting, you're going to see some violence. That's the unfortunate part of it. But just think about this. When Martin and John Lewis was marching, it was turn the other cheek. When Malcolm X had his word, it was an eye for an eye. So then Black people ask themselves, you give me no choice. Regardless of what option I choose, you still have an issue with it. And so now as we've graduated to 2020, I appreciate for the mass consumption, the people who want to live isolated and don't want to embrace people that don't necessarily look like them, that weren't necessarily born in America, so to speak. I think because that demographic publicly has continued to shrink, we're now going to start to get closer to some level of equality because young people will devise and make sure we have that change.
Well, speaking of peaceful protesting, we know a lot of the NBA players were considering sitting out this season if there weren't steps taken in the direction of social justice. And the NBA listened, they responded, they have taken some action. So how do you think that sports organizations can, even further than what they've done now, advance their actions in terms of social justice?
Well, it's such a good question. And I think Jalen tapped into it when he just was talking about equality. But we need to be pushing a little bit past equality and justice into equity now. Equity is an ownership conversation, and that's what the league can do. When you look at the demographics of the NBA, where are the Black owners? Where are the Black pension funds managing resources for the NBA? Where are the Black vendors, right? Those are the conversations that need to begin, that they need to begin having, and quickly, right? Because the other thing that we know for far too long in this country, there have been a lot of things talked about theoretically and philosophically with no change. And so what is incumbent upon the NBA, the NFL, MLB, and others is to really start talking about financial inclusion for people of color. How to ensure that people aren't just working on behalf of the institution, but becoming owners of that institution. That we're growing financial and economic development and empowerment opportunities in communities of color. Don't just rely on these young folks to go and buy your sneakers. What does your board look like? right? Those are the conversations that we really have to begin having, and quickly, to really see a shift in this country. It's not just on the government, whether we're talking about the federal, state, or the local level. It's also on private institutions and corporations.
And Jalen, you brought up different types of protests. And one thing I want to bring to light is we saw last night with the opening of the MLB season, the kneel before the anthem, but also on the West Coast, Mookie Betts kneeled during the anthem. I think that's an important distinction because one was sort of league sanctioned and one wasn't. And I looked to sort of see the different reactions from those two different things in the coming days and as more games happen and those distinctions are made.
Yes, I think this is also super important. Colin Kaepernick was demonized for taking this step. And in that step that he took, he also took the time to educate the culture on why he kneeled, on what the lyrics were in that national anthem that were so damning, not just to Black people, but it should be to everyone. We never talk about the second stanza of the national anthem, where they talk about terrorizing enslaved person, basically, an enslaved person. We ignore that. We turn a blind eye to it. And by we, I'm not talking about myself or Black folks. I'm talking about this country. Turns a blind eye to something that can terrorize a human being in that way. And we'll say, oh, well, it's just the way it is. Whenever we start talking about something that's uncomfortable, we say it's just the way it is, rather than saying, well, what happens if we did change this? What happens if we did adjust this? This is a problem for folks. There are people in this country who are Black, who are carrying trauma in their DNA through ancestral memory, carrying what it means to be a runaway enslaved person, carrying what it means to be brutalized on a plantation. We should not continue to perpetuate that trauma with something such as the national anthem. I know that's a touchy conversation, but we're in this moment that I think is great because we're questioning so much. We're able now to finally see things from different perspectives, and there's nothing wrong with asking the question. That's where the start of an honest dialogue is.
Well, education is certainly key, and I think it's so important that athletes are using their platforms to not only teach their fans about social justice, but also really even the organizations that they work for. So it's huge. Angela, we want to thank you for your time. You have been amazing, and we wish you a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You too.
All right, guys, next up, we're heading back into the bubble. Must the Bucks win the title this season to guarantee Giannis's future in Milwaukee? We're going to discuss the reigning MVP coming up.